But I just want to say what a pleasure it is, how happy I am to be involved in Vinnie Bagwell's Enslaved African Rain Garden project in Yonkers. I can't believe it's been 12 years. These characters was Themba, Isate, Bibi, the elder, the little young Sola, and Olumide. They all came to life. When I saw them, it was a no-brainer for me to put the voices and the words to them, because her work just was alive already, and it just came to life. And so I can't believe it's been this long. I'm just happy that it has come to fruition. I can't wait to see them actually on the pier there in Yonkers. I can't wait to actually walk up to them, and knowing that I had a part of this, I'm just happy and proud. And Vinnie Bagwell is a godsend, a treasure, and her work just makes my work easy. So it was easy for me to become the voices of the Enslaved African Rain Garden.
My name is Themba Isakibe. Themba meaning faith, hope, trust. Isakibe meaning Lord of the boat, Master of the sea. My first language was isiZulu, from the Bantu. I was taught Portuguese by my original captors and Dutch by their successors. So I beg your indulgence in my feeble attempt at using the English tongue. I was born in Namibia, what the English call Angola, the West Cape, South Africa, in the year 1670. Born by the sea, for the sea. Indeed, I could swim before I could walk. Before I was 10, I could pilot through inland passages. Lagoons and barrier reefs presented no problem to me. I could negotiate shorelines, low tide or high. I knew water markings and wind speed, could navigate with full moon or no moon at all. I was a boatman who saw 15 rains before I was kidnapped and brought to the shores of America. As a child, I was besieged by many stories of slave catchers who, in the dead of night, stole children from their villages. Countless stories of black devils who dragged little ones to slave pens where they were never seen again. Many stories of the white-eyed ghosts who put people in the bellies of big boats and sailed them to the end of the earth. In my 15th year, fortune would befall that I become the narrative and render legitimate all the old wives' tales I had heard. For I found myself chained and manacled in the hold of the slave ship King Charles. My words cannot do justice to the misery attached to the journey. The totality of the suffering defies description. Suffice it to say that no human should suffer such, and I can imagine no hell worse than the belly of a slave ship. the hold is a dark place, void of the sun. We were only brought to half deck when we were fed and washed. I thereby lost track of the days, so there was no way I could measure how long we were at sea. When we landed upon these shores, I could understand but few words and was removed to being pushed and shoved by way of communication. However, I was pointed out as a boatman, an able seaman who knew ships and sailing. Although I did not at the time know the names of them, my early experience had shown me how to pilot a galleon, a cutter, an East Indiaman, a sloop, and even a Guineaman. If it could float, I could sail it. I learned that the vessel I sailed in on was owned by Frederick Philippe, and that he owned everything in every direction I looked. North, south, east, or west. He owned all the land and all the maritime as well. My first 3 years was in the pure service as a slave, but because of my craft and swift grasp of my circumstance, I was granted manumission my 4th year. This grant was not without warrant. Indeed, I had earned my freedom. You see, within those 3 years, I had steered the Beaver, the New Netherland Indian, the Pearl, the Morning Star, and the vessel on which I sailed in, the King Charles. Further, I had earned the favor of the Mrs. Margaret Phillips, who was wont to teach me in the way of manners and cartography. She was also wont to boast on the swiftness of my apprenticeship. I clearly recall my first voyage as a navigator on the Pearl. As we spotted the shoreline of Madagascar, we were overtaken by a swift-sailing cutter captained by Adam Baldridge, a bandit who was of some extensive repute. I soon learned that Captain Baldridge was in league with my owner, Master Philippe, and that this was just the first of many encounters with the slaver. It was revealed also that Captain Baldridge was not the only pirate with which Mr. Philippe did business. I also learned that, as genteel as she was, the Mrs. Margaret was no stranger to the scabbard and sword. My third exploration was of such significance that the story bears telling. I was now used to being at the helm, the captain only being responsible for such duty at landfall or at such time when the sea was exceedingly distasteful. It is no light fare keeping a ship steady, fighting mast and keel and sail. On this day, we collected no less than 50 poor souls off the coast of Guinea. I remember there being 40 men, 8 women, and 2 children, a boy of perhaps 10 and a girl of perhaps 7, whom all were in dire disrepair, to say the least. A part of my duties had evolved to interpreting, or, it is better said, trying to interpret for my countrymen. On this occasion, the cargo, as they were called, was being offloaded from the Beaver and carried by dinghy and cockboat to the Pearl. The wretched souls were thrown into the small craft 10 at a time. This was one of the few voyages where we did not ferry to port. The enslaved were brought aboard up gangplank. One of the wretched, I recall, having no shoes, slipped and fell. His neck hit the brow and was broken. We watched him drift with the tide, and no one retrieved the poor soul's body. What made this day even more outstanding in the mind of this sailor is I was blessed by God to look into the eyes of a woman that I knew would never remain enslaved. There was a fierceness in her gaze that caused me to immediately fear for her life, for I knew that she would be tossed overboard if she raised enough ruckus. The scoundrels with whom I sailed would sooner throw a winch to the sharks than put up with insolence. Yet, somehow, I knew she would survive. There was an uprightness to her shoulders and a pride in her gaze that brought my thoughts back to her almost daily. One warm spring afternoon, more than a year later, I was docking at Schreer's Hook after sailing some 10 nauticals up Hudson's River. I remember feeling good as I had successfully negotiated trade with the Manhattoes for more than 100 pelt of mink and sable. Master Philippe was wont to trade with the Mohicans, with the Sinsink, the Tappans, and most all the Delaware people. This duty fell upon me because of my apprenticeship and my ability to befriend most all of the natives. I remember she was walking toward the sawmill, carrying a bushel on her head, and my heart felt like a sail blasted by a powerful nor'easter. It was her of the fierce eyes. She walked with such grace and purpose, and I remember my thinking, she walks like a smooth-sailing ship, and the fierceness in her eyes will weather all storms. She was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. She was the forlorn wench I had first seen manacled in the hole of the beaver, ragtag and torn. Now she was a maiden fair from Guinea, a queen-like and stately. She was Isati, and I knew in my heart she would one day be my bride.
My name is Isati, which means to mend, to sew, and to heal. Although I was captured by the slavers at the place they now call Guinea, the true name of my home is Mamo. I am the Futa Fula Fulani and the people of Songay. My family are weavers, seamsters, and seamstresses to the royal families of Songay. There was no fabric that could not be spun. There was no silk that could not be woven. And it was widely recognized by all that I was born with the gift of knitting and stitching. By the time I was 14, I was well on my way to becoming #1 seamstress in my village. Indeed, it was believed that God himself guided my hand. Before my capture, I was being prepared to oversee the creation of most all the apparel worn at every coronation or festive occasion, for I was the daughter of Matumbe, the chief needleworker. My days were spent learning, reading the text of the ancients and studying the rich and glorious history of my people. School was filled with stories of conquest and intrigue. I loved the oral tradition of our griot, Malibu. He could change the atmosphere with his voice. The young of the village would sit for hours and listen to story after story, tale after tale. It was our task to remember, then retell the tales to our family and friends. The day of my capture will never be forgotten. It was 7 days in front of my 18th reign. As it was custom, I was gathering flora for my coronation. It was to be a grand affair. Most all of my village would be bedecked in the finest raiment, all prepared by my family. By the year 1670, my village had been trading with the Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish, and French for more than 200 years. I had heard stories of kidnappings, but because of my status, believed no such ill fortune would befall me. I, along with 2 cousins, ventured west into a garden filled with marigold, as it was the color of my raiment and the flowers which lined my apprentice mantle. One moment I was bending and gathering, the next I was surrounded by 20 or more tall men from a tribe I did not know. They threw a sack of burlap over me. I was knocked to the ground and lay there for a long, long time. When I was jostled awake, there were other men who placed chains and manacles on perhaps 15 of us, some of whom were from my village. We marched for 3 sunrises, and each day there were more of us. When we came upon the shore, there were perhaps 20 or more white men, whom I believe had been released from hell itself. The rabble had long hair, blue-white eyes, and they smelled like wet goats. They laid the lash upon the backs of those who moved slowly with whips made of bull hide. While shouting words that none of us could understand, they screamed and spit like madmen. We were thrown into canoes and shipped out to the Man-Eater. Man-Eater is the name that was given to the big boats that swallowed my people and ate them while alive. Before this journey was over, I wished 100 times that the legend was true, as death would have been a more pleasant outcome than the fate that had befallen me. I have no way of conveying how much time was spent in the belly of the Man-Eater. I don't have words in English to explain the miserable state of the wretched souls that were thrown atop each other like mackerel from a fisherman's net. If not for the fierceness of my pride, all human dignity would have been stripped from me, as it was stripped from so many poor souls. There are no words that properly explain the expression on one's face and how the light of life leaves one's eyes while they're yet alive just before they leap to certain death in the raging sea. There are no words that convert the sound of weeping and wailing. There is no translation for the moaning and anguish delivered through the cat o' nine tails. There are no words for the stench of urine, feces, and fear that mingled and rose from the hold of the good ship Beaver. After sailing perhaps 2 fortnights, there is no way of knowing exactly. We are transferred from the Beaver to the Pearl. I remember seeing one of my countrymen slip on the plank. His neck snapped like a green bean. He tumbled to his death and drifted off with the tide. I recall my thinking was that he might be better off than the surviving lot of us. On the Pearl, I was thrown in the hole beside several sacks of cayenne Carter red pepper. There were 2 who lay beside me whose bodies reacted to the pepper in a manner that caused their bodies to swell. Their eyes bulged and hives broke out all over their skin. They moaned and groaned as their bodies bloated and swollen to almost bursting. The black pilot of the ship, who was not the captain I would later learn, was the cause of me being removed from beside the pepper. I must say that, had he not provided intervention, I would have died from my fits of sneezing and coughing. We arrived at New Amsterdam in the high heat of summer. There was such a bustling ruckus and busyness banding about that confusion seemed to be the order of the day, and there were as many black milling about as white. I was taken to a tavern where I was washed by some black women who spoke only Dutch, Portuguese, and a dialect of Mindi that I could not understand. They fed me, washed me, cleaned my hair, and put a dress on me that was so heavy it felt like walking with bushels upon my shoulders. After 2 sunrises, I was placed in a horse carriage with 2 children, a girl around 10 years of age and a boy around 8, along with another wench, as we were called. It was a day's ride from the dock to Hudson Bay to the sprawling green estate at Phillips Manor. The strangeness of the dwelling confounded me, for I had never seen anything similar. We approached during the night, and the lanterns in the 2 large windows made it appear to be a huge monster with yellow eyes, with smoke billowing from 2 chimneys that looked like ears on either side. It was as terrifying as a slave ship. We were taken to a small wooden hut, one of perhaps 10 lined along the south side of the estate. There we were given food, water, and blankets. On the very next sunrise, we were all, more than 30 or so, including little Sola and Olumide, forced to stand in a line as the Mrs. Margaret Phillips, an overseer named Master Henry, and 2 house slaves inspected us. The missus appeared to have no lips, just a cruel line where her mouth should be, and the meanest set of eyes I'd ever seen on a human. After inspecting us all, she came back to me, and the line where her mouth should be softened a little. She beckoned me from the line and instructed both Sola and Olumide to accompany her to the manor. It was there made clear that I was to see after the children. After the children, I worked from can't see to can't see. I emptied the slop buckets. I scrubbed and cleaned the linen, the walls, the doors, the soot from the fireplace and the soot from the kiln. I washed the windows, the dishes, the pots, and the pans. I swat the carpets, swept and mopped the floors, scraped the wax from the candle holders, mended the curtains, dusted the furniture, and fed the dogs. I slopped the hogs and fed the chickens. I milked the cows and cleaned the troughs. I polished the silver and the guns. I washed the clothes, darned the socks, sewed the sweaters and the coats. When I expect I worked 18 to 20 hours a day, I worked till my back, my knees, and my hands pained me to tears. There were 2 occasions where I saw the boatman named Themba who had rescued me from the death of the red pepper. Once, while I was braiding Sola's hair, he entered the rear of the mansion, never seeing me. And once, when Olumide and I were at the wharf collecting perch and codfish, he never saw me. I was a slave on the estate for 12 moons before he spotted me carrying a bushel of pears on the dock at Schuyler's Hook, where our eyes locked. My heart forgot to beat for a time. From that day forward, every day that he was landside, I would see him. One late evening before Sabbath, as there was no work the next day, he heard me singing a song from my homeland. I was again braiding Shola's hair while singing in my native Pula and Fula. He came close to the porch and smiled while I sang. He did something which caused my heart to almost leap like a white-tailed deer. He spoke to me in both Pula and Fula. I had not heard the language of my people spoken so beautifully in more than a year's time. His words had hope and promise in them. When he finished speaking and I continued singing, it was his voice which made the music.
My name is Omalara. It means wanted. But everyone here calls me Bibi for grandmother, including the masters of the manor. I am an old woman now, and my recall is not what it was. But of the things I do remember, I shall share with you. Perhaps it would be better served if I were to explain how I came to acquire both my name and my present condition. I was born of the Karanga in the Mutapa Empire, Zimbabwe, in the south of Africa. I was raised in the Zambezi Valley among much wealth and splendor. My parents were descendant cousins of the great Changamairi. They would tell stories of the king's court in all its magnificence and were well respected throughout the vast city and all its provinces. My father was a scholar and our village griot. He not only made known the oral traditions of our people, but he transcribed what was spoken into the written word as well. Much of my time as a child was spent learning. By the time I was 10, I could speak many dialects of Swahili, and I could also speak dialects of Igbo, Portuguese, and French. I was betrothed in my 15th year, married in my 18th year, and had bore this world 2 wonderful boys by my 21st year. Their names are Jamba and Isa. My 33rd year is when everything changed. The Portuguese slave catchers, called the Chikunda, they invaded most all the provinces save that of Batua, where the great Changa once ruled. I remember It was the rainy season, and it was my duty to tend to my mother's sister, who was with child. In the midst of my aunt's delivery, the slave catchers came, like a swarming herd. The Chikunda were slavers mixed with conquistadors from Portugal. They waylaid our entire village. They destroyed everything in their sight. The older men and women were massacred by the hundreds. My Bibi, my grandmother, and all the babus, the grandfathers, were slaughtered. I have never laid my eyes on my mother, my father, my husband, or my children since that day. That day, I lost my family and my freedom. More than 50 of us were marched down to the river. The youngest were tied together with rope. The older were put in iron shackles around their legs, and the strongest even with neck shackles, I remember. We were forced into canoes and taken miles up the Zambezi. I shall never forget my cousin Asani and the blood. He was stabbed in his gut and thrown over the side for spitting in the face of a Chikunda. Asani means rebellious one. He died, living up to his name. 2, perhaps 3 crocodiles seized upon him at once. They tore him limb from limb, and he was mangled to pieces in front of our faces. It was a horror that shall never be forgotten. We sailed 3 days upriver in the dugout canoes and transferred to a great melee, the name of which I cannot recall. We were taken below deck and were only allowed above the deck in the mornings for dousing and feeding. Buckets of seawater were thrown on us to cleanse the filth of waste and vomit which we spilled upon each other. Then we were fed some vile sort of porridge that only hogs should be fed. We sailed to the place called Madagascar, where there were so many imprisoned that I could not count. Every tongue you can imagine was spoken there. It was a market for the sale of human beings, and there could have been no more wretched place on earth than Nitaranarasi, which means the bad place in the language of the Malagasy. I was there more than 18 months. It became my duty to tend to the young ones, and they would attach themselves to me. I had to nurse their wounds, which came as the result of all manner of evil behavior. Though I was yet young myself, because there were no old people there, they called me Bibi, grandmother. One morning, before the sun came over the rise, after those many months, we were marched from the bad place out to the seashore. This time there were more than 100 of us. Once again, we walked up the plank of the great melee. It was the pink called the Charles. You could smell its filth from 50 yards away. We landed on the shores of America in the fall of 1685. This I know because I heard a Dutchman tell a Frenchman what the year was, and that the first organized street lamps had been put up in Amsterdam. It was my 35th year. I remember thinking, this is a primitive place, because every child knew that oil lamps had lit the thoroughfares of Mutapa and Timbuktu from the time of the first emperor. Every child knew that King Solomon's mines were in Mutapa, where the streets were paved with gold and the lamps were lit with whale oil and frankincense. I'm also certain it was the fall, because that was the first time I had ever felt the cold. It was as if the sun had no interest in this place. My bones ached from the cold and the rain. The first time I heard the word Phillips and kidnapper were in the same discourse. I would come to learn that my captors would be responsible for the enslavement of many, many thousand of my kinsmen. After some haggling and severe disagreements, a cruel burlap was thrown over our shivering shoulders, and 8 of us were placed in a wagon. It took half a day's journey to the place where I would spend my next 65 years. On the day we arrived, there was so much bustling about. The building of the large manor was underway, and there seemed to be at the least 70 men working on it. The Master Frederick, the Master Adolph, the Mrs. Margaret, and some of the native people were there to inspect us. There were tribesmen of all kinds, speaking different tongues, and slaves working feverishly, carrying wood, water, and other sundries necessary for the raising of the large mansion. After our inspection, we were taken to the creek where we bathed. We were given clothing and we were fed there. Immediately, I was put to work, carrying timber and water from the creek to the sawmill, and from the sawmill to the work sites scattered across the landscape. There were pelts being dried and stretched in this place, iron being smithed in that place, oxen dragging wagons in this place, clay being drawn from the mud pit here, clamshells shucked from the creek bed there, and carried to the kiln for firing over there. It was just all manner of movement, so vast as to make one think of ants scurrying about. We worked until the sun exhausted itself before we were taken to the slave shanties. The shanties were no more than a few boards of wood thrown together. There we slept until the sun rose, and we were put to work again. After more than a month of this daily routine, I was summoned to the manor by the young Master Adolph and the Mrs. Margaret. There I was told that my duties would be to tend to all the incoming enslaved children. They included making sure their wounds were tended, and to also teach them in the ways of the so-called genteel. In short, I was charged with civilizing the savages as quickly as possible. I was moved to the back quarters in the great house, where I was given dresses and aprons to wear. It became my duty also to serve the master's guests when they were visiting, and there I would be privy to every stream of conversation. I heard Master Adolph say on more than a few occasions that God had favored him with the seafaring slave called Themba the Boatman. They would speak of him, and indeed all of us, as if we had no understanding, as if we were not human or perhaps invisible to them somehow. I believe they thought of us as cattle or sheep or horses. Of all the children who were enslaved here, it is Sola whom I miss the most. She was the sweetest child, with the voice of a Levite angel. Her singing would calm the restless soul and make even a wounded animal purr like a kitten. Isati, with her gift of language, was of all the children the most help to me. When I think back so many children were uprooted, lost their freedom, and found their way to Marinick. The Phillips found a way to use them all to their advantage. I found a way to love them all. Some were sold off to God knows where. Some worked till their deaths right here. Some worked the upper mill. They all became family, and I have outlived them all. You see, we were not allowed to bury our dead at Sleepy Hollow with the whites. So we fashioned our own burial ground on the knoll just west of the upper mill. Some believe it is haunted by the ghost of those interred there. Some say you may hear them weeping and wailing on cold, dark nights. I have never heard such myself. I have made it my duty to visit there on Sundays, and to no one's knowledge but my own, I would take a small rock and carve the names of my loved ones to mark their graves. Themba, Isati, Sola, and are buried there. Olumide is there, and many more. I tell you this now as an old woman who no longer has the strength to climb the knoll and visit those loved ones. But I tell you this so that you would know that I have carved the name Bibi Omalara into a small rock, and it would serve my soul that when my time comes to rest, you would be so kind as to place me and the stone there, so that at least the earth will know that I too made a contribution, and at long last I now have my freedom. My name is Sola, Olu Sola. It means God's grace. I was born on Nobaraha, Ile Sainte Marie, which some call St. Mary's Isle. I am small for my age. Whenever anyone is told that I am 8 reigns old, they cut their eyes in disbelief. I only learned this, that I am small, from the slavers here and the Delaware tribesmen who worked the shipyard. They call me Little Sola, even though I have known 8 rain cycles in my lifetime. I know this because when I had lived to my 5th reign, my father placed a black diamond around my neck he had bought from the bazaar at Madagascar. It was the best day of my life so far. My father was of the Tswana, near the southmost tip of Africa. He was a nephew of the great King Mugali, ruler of Tswana, and all the land as far as any eye could see. My father traveled the whole world over, trading for the great king. He would tell stories of fierce lions, giant elephants, and long-necked giraffes. On one of his many trips back from Angola, I asked him why my name was so strange and not like other Malagasy. He told me the true meaning of my name. He said, I was the grace of God, and Olushola meant God's grace in the language of the Yoruba. Not many days after my father gifted me with the black diamond, a blanket was thrown over my head while I slept. I was kidnapped from our home and taken to a dark hole in the ground with many more people. Some I had seen before. We were there for many days. We were then taken to a small sailing boat, the name of which I do not remember. We sailed for a short time and was set ashore at the very same place in Madagascar, where my father had bought the diamond. We were closed in a pen with many, many people like sheep and cows, far too many for me to count. They came from places all over Africa, places I heard stories of, places far, far away. I only spoke Malagasy and could not understand many of the words they spoke, but we all called the pen Nitorena Ratse, the bad place. After many days, to my surprise and to my great joy, I discovered my mother. My mother was in the bad place with me. I was both sad and happy. She comforted me for more than 5 days before a white man with no teeth struck her in the head with a drinking gourd. I cried as the blood dripped from her ear. She died with her head in my lap. I prayed to Almighty God Modimo that he would free me from the bad place and let me die with her. My father had taught me that the one and only God Modimo could do anything. After many moons, I was given the job of water monkey. That's what the white men called us who fetched water to the overseers. For 2 long rain seasons in that pen, I was a Renogidro water monkey. I saw a great lot of people come there from many ships. I saw many of them die. I prayed a lot of prayers to the great Modimo for my own death. I prayed before the day we were forced aboard the large man-eater called the St. Charles. I remember this day for many reasons. One reason was it was the first time my eyes saw the great black boatman called Themba. It is so fixed in my mind because, one, he was the only black man who was not a slave, and two, in the more than 2 reigns since my capture, he was the first man I had seen, black or white, with kind eyes. He sailed us to the coast of Guinea, where we were transferred from the Charles to the Beaver. Perhaps a fortnight later, we were again transferred to the Pearl. By my count, it was close to 50 of us. Other than seeing Themba's fine, handsome face every day, the main memory I have of the sailing is that twice daily we would be brought to the top of the ship and doused with buckets of seawater. The salt would sting our eyes and sting whatever sore there may be. I can remember also the great big whales. They seemed as large as the ship itself. I recall also the many, many dolphins who swam with such grace alongside the ships. At last we reached the shore of Turtle Island, the land the white man called America. I became very ill before we made landfall and was covered in blankets for most of the inland journey. I cannot recall most of it. When we finally arrived at this place called the Manor, I was awakened from my sleep by a very tall white woman called Mrs. I had first seen her on the ship St. Charles. She was very graceful, but there was a crease where her mouth should be, as though she had no lips at all. It is my belief that the missus had a special fondness for me, though she never smiled. It was clear she thought better of me than others. I believe this because of the fine raiment she provided for me. The missus took me to the large manor where there was a fire in a hole in the wall. It was so huge, like the Zoe cavern we would explore back home. I fell in and out of sleep due to the fever which had once again beset me, and remember very little except the flames from the logs in the hole in the wall. In the fire, I could see my home. Though it was just a dream, I could see the Lolo butterfly and their magnificent colors. I dreamed my ancestors spoke to me through the mouths of the Gidro, the lemurs, who spoke through the fire. Not many days after my fever broke, I was taken to the front yard of Philippe Manor, along with the boy who was with me in the pen back in Madagascar. His name is Olumide. We had been together for more than 2 years now. In Madagascar, on the Charles, the Beaver, and on the Pearl. All of the Africans who were enslaved at the manor were summoned to the front yard on that day. The missus handed Olumide and I over to a beautiful Dahomey queen who could have easily been my mother's sister. Her name is Isati. I remember it well and shall never forget, because it was the first time I had seen both kindness and hope in the eyes of any human being in the 3 rain seasons since my capture. She reminded me of my mother, my village, my home, where I longed to be. It fell upon Olumide and I to serve at the hand of Isati. We would accompany her to the shipyards and perform many chores. We would gather fruit from the market along with yarn of wool and silk. We would help with the preparing of meals, the scaling of fish, the kneading of bread. Every fortnight, Isati would braid my hair. On those days, I would long for the evening's chores to be done, when she would sit me between her knees and caress my locks. Those times were the best. They reminded me of my mother and home. She said my hair was the silk of the gods. There were those days when the great Themba would return from the high seas, and he would bring gifts of raiment from Botswana and Madagascar. He bought me a turquoise silk scarf so beautiful that I am afraid to wash it for fear of losing its scent of sandalwood. On those rare days when he would return, he and Isati would speak in Fula, so much so that I began to learn the tongue. We would speak in Malagasy of the sakoa, a fruit from my home so sweet there are no words to describe in the English tongue. We would talk of the lemurs, whom our ancestors spoke through. There are no lemurs here. Everyone knows the ancestors lived with the lemur, and there are no lemurs here. We would recall the taste of the poma, which you call the apple, and the exquisite wings of the lolo, which I now call the butterfly. What I miss most about Madagascar, and especially Ile Sainte-Marie, is the warmth. It is very, very cold here. I miss the warmth of my home. This place can never get so warm as my home. The word for home in Malagasy is Antrano. I miss my Antrano. With every new word I learned, I smiled, because each and every word reminded me of my mother, my father, my village, my home. I believe I should start my story with my name, because my name almost says it all. Olumide means God has arrived. In the language of my people, Fulani of Guinea, the boatman Themba, he says there is irony in my name. I must confess that after surviving the Middle Passage, the almost impossible journey from West Africa, and landing here on the shores of America, I sincerely question if my mother and father had not made a mistake in so naming me, because surely I did not belong in such a cruel and God-forsaken place. I was born among the artisans of my people. My mother, father, aunts, uncles, and cousins, all were the culture makers. They were sculptors and painters. They were builders who worked in wood, brass, and coral. They were silver and goldsmiths. They were mask makers who worked bronze and clay. They made embroidery and weaved the silk. My people knew earth science. They grew the mulberry, which brought the silkworm. They could conjure the silk moth from anafe cocoons. And their kente and sanyan cloth clothed my people. My uncle was the griot of our village. He could tell stories for hours, even days on end, and no one would ever tire of them. I can remember but little until my 7th year. Perhaps the events that ripped me from my home serve as a line in the folds of my brain, for they were so severe that I shall never in this lifetime forget them. As I recall, it was a bright sunny day and there was a great commotion. It seemed that from nowhere and everywhere there appeared 100 mandinke pounding on the djembe drum. Our village, Kumara, was a few kilometers west of Kurosa. Kurosa is known for its arts and its crafts, not war. We were all so quickly frightened. We were as your possum here, shocked motionless with fear, not able to move. The Mande warriors towered over me. They seemed as tall as trees. One placed a sack over my head and pushed me with his spear. 1 minute I was playing, the next I was being forced to a place I know not where. I have no way of knowing how long we were nudged and pricked to move along so, day after day. We marched from sun up till the sun set and were only fed enough to survive the journey, until we came to where the land ended and the sea began. There to behold was one of the most frightful sights of my life. It was the dreadful floating man-eater, the Melee. It was called the good ship Charles, though I have never learned why the word good was applied to it. We could smell the stench of its cargo a full day before we spotted it. It reeked of death and rank fear. Fear has a stink of its own. We were placed 10 at a time in a rough canoe and sailed out to the monster. It was known by all civilized people that the great beast would swallow us whole and we would never be seen again. Of the things I have done, it was among the most terrible. I remember there being 2 women with child. They were so terrified that just before we reached the vessel, they leaped over the side to their deaths rather than be eaten. by the wooden monster. I would soon learn that fate can be worse than death. Once we were forced onto the ship and placed in its hold, there are not many words to describe its wretchedness. The suffering was so complete that my only wish was to die and visit my ancestors. We were laid in the hold in rows like mackerel, one atop the other. The morning after the first night, we were forced to the deck at sword point and doused with seawater. The ship's crew would crack their whips and make us jump and skip, which they called dancing. It was a most miserable affair. At last, we came upon the shore of Madagascar, where we were moved to a very large hole in the ground. The Malagasy called it Neteranarazi, the bad place. I cannot be sure how many months I spent in the slave pen there, the bad place. At last we were herded on to the Charles once more, this time close to 70 of us. We were moved from the Charles to the Beaver, this being a ship slightly smaller than the former and utterly more sufferable. We sailed for what I now know is a combined 4 fortnights, moving once more from the Beaver, now to the Pearl. At last we reached the port called Hudson Bay, in the place here, New York. I had never seen nor heard nor smelled such confusion. I had been to market in my homeland, but never had I seen all manner of humanity teeming and bustling so. The smell of fish and of gunpowder, the smell of beaver, elk, and of fox was enough to wrench the gut it was. Before our docking, I had only seen my tribesmen, my neighbors, and the few white men who had made the voyage. I had never seen the ruddy skin color of the Manhattan, the strange features of a Chinaman, nor had I seen the face-painted splendor of the Mohawk. Our feet were shackled, and we were shuffled off to the market square between Pearl and Water Street. They shoed us in the slave pen like you would shoe a hog or a cow. We were kept there most of 3 days. I remember well because little Sola, who had been among us since Madagascar, I thought she was going to die from the fever. The slave pen of New York was the coldest place I had ever been in my 11 years of living. After 3 days, we were taken in wagons to this great large estate where the grass was vast. It seemed to be rolling in the wind, so green. We were greeted by the woman called Bibi, which I learned in Swahili meant grandmother. She had the kindest eyes I had ever seen. She was an angel of mercy who nursed upon us. She fed us broth and bade us sit in tubs of water where we were cleaned. The next day, we were marched to the front lawn of the enormous manor, a mammoth mansion so huge as to defy explanation. I had not seen a dwelling so massive in my life. We were placed in a line so as to be inspected by Lord Master Frederick Philippe and his steel-eyed wife, the Mrs. Margaret. I recall thinking that I had never seen a human with skin so white as hers. She was as pale as a ghost and appeared to have almost no lips at all. In her eyes, Her eyes were the color of ice blue, cold as the Atlantic seawater. When the missus looked at me, she asked Hakima Bibi what I was called, what name I was given. When she replied, Olumide, it just then occurred to me that if my name held true, God just may have arrived in the same place as the devil.